will ask for that specifically.
Awesome. Okay, I'll send it out right now then.
Lastly, do you guys have any questions about my paradigm? I'm hoping you've all read it.
Yep.
Okay, great.
BCC, what email am I on for the chain? I'm not sure which one I sent for y'all.
Marcus,
Okay, yeah, that's the right email. All good. Okay.
I haven't. Okay, I just got the email chain. Great. Cool.
Okay.
Yeah, Marcus and I should be ready to go whenever y'all.
All right, we are as well. Is everyone ready?
No.
Eli and I affirm contention 1 is COVID, subpoint A is credit. COVID-19 shutdowns have collapsed tax revenue, causing Phillips 20, the New York Times, to find governments on the hook for billions in interest and principal repayments. Unless their interest rates fall or they are given loan extensions, both of which require good credit, dozens of countries will default. Fortunately, Broomaway to the NPE writes, less developed economies draw on the credibility of the IMF for demanding macroeconomic restraint as a way to signal to international audiences that they are safe to destination because they've chosen to tie their hands. Thus, guaranteeing the Lehman Center confirms of 117 statements from rating agencies mentioning the IMF, 84 indicate a positive influence while only 1 mentions a negative one. Subpoint B is SDRs. The IMF maintains its own reserves known as SDRs in order to distribute them to member nations during global economic crises. The BWP09 explains SDR allocations do not involve the IMF staff negotiating, meaning there's no conditionality involved and no required policy changes. On top of being unconditional, SDR allocations are massive and free. Specifically for COVID, Reuters 21 writes, G20 major economies have agreed to a new allocation of the IMF's SDRs totaling $500 billion. Every member of the IMF will receive its own share, immediately contributing to reserves. This increase in reserves is massive and helps nations afford vaccines and revitalize economies. Thus, Hard 20 of Yale University finds the 2009 allocation helped to restore market confidence and support global recovery. Today, the 2020 allocation is nearly twice as large as 09, leading Sonnet 20, the SBT, to find SDRs are the most useful instrument to help contain the pandemic and keep the global economy from further collapsing. Recovery is key as Oxfam 20 writes that fallout from the coronavirus could push 500 million people into poverty. Contention 2 is debt. Subpoint A is relief aid. Bird 07 of the Journal of Development Studies writes the presence of a fund program serves as a catalyst for donors because they signal the policy credibility. Fund programs signal recipient merit as borrowing countries show they are committed to putting their house in order. As a result, sub-16 of World Development finds IMF recipients are 25% more likely to receive general budget support and 26% for debt relief aid. That's key as it enables governments to pay off massive debts and avert default. Subpoint B is the HIPC. Castleman 15 of the University of Antwerp writes, the IMF launched the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative in 1996. The key objective was to ensure that reform efforts by debtors were not put at risk by high debt. This initiative renegotiated and paid off debts for poor countries with great success. Castleman concludes, debt stocks will be almost 90% lower than pre-HIPC debt relief. Reducing debts through relief in the HIPC is key as absent these measures, debt and interest spirals, producing bankruptcy. Saxon 1 of the Global Inequity terminalizes state bankruptcy has powerful destabilizing effects on society. Bankrupt states cannot provide basic public goods, repeatedly contributing to revolutions, coups, and violence. Contention 3 is China. The IMF protects countries against the harmful effects of Chinese loans in 2 ways. First is competition. IMF and Chinese loans trade off, competing with each other. Sunquist 21 of Boston University writes, a 1% of GDP loan from China reduces a country's probability of beginning an IMF program by 60%. This trade-off forces both organizations to have better and more transparent practices in order to maintain partnerships and influence. However, Gerstle 18 of the CSIS writes, without the IMF, countries will have limited options for support outside of China and will fall deeper into debt. This follows logically. With China as the only source of credit, Chinese loans could have any conditions they wanted, stealing strategically vital assets, trapping countries with absurd interest rates, and causing default. With both, however, each organization must offer increasingly beneficial terms, protecting nations. Second is scrutiny. Gerstle continues that the IMF has scrutinized multiple aspects of the BRI, repeatedly warning of unsustainable debt levels, predatory lending, and a lack of project transparency. The IMF process improves the transparency of projects and puts countries on a path to debt sustainability. More importantly, it reduces the risk that recipient countries forfeit strategically important assets in return for Chinese debt forgiveness. These forms of IMF protection have 2 massive impacts. The first is averting default. Tan 19 of the CNBC writes, an opaque buildup of debt caused by China's lack of transparency in issuing loans could pose a risk to the world economy. Indeed, widespread debt crises have historically had horrific effects as they crush social spending and access to financial markets. Jubilee 19 confirms the debt crisis of the 80s led to 2 lost decades of development and 125 million people pushed into extreme poverty. Second is preventing hegemony by preventing asset seizure. Brands 20 of Foreign Policy writes, as China builds economic power, it will sharpen its capacity to convert that into geopolitical influence. This would reshape the international order and expand the space for authoritarianism, constraining transparency. That's devastating as repressive regimes engender civilian violence, leading Rost 05 of the UNT to find the probability of a civil war onset increases by a factor of 16 in repressive authoritarian countries. To avoid this, we are proud to affirm.
Can I come up with one piece of evidence?
Sure.
Can I see that China would start stealing assets without the IMF? I think it's something Gerstle.
Yeah.
Or do you have that, or do you want me to grab it?
What's up, Eli?
Do you want me to grab that, or do you?
I got it.
And then can I get the evidence on the second link that says the IMF like forces like transparency on?
Yeah, they're the same. Or I sent both. It's
Okay,
not from two parts.
beautiful.
Yeah, we just read two parts of the same article from Gerstle. Yeah.
Okay, we'll let you know when we get it. Okay, I just got it. Can everyone hear me all right? Sounds good. And is anyone not ready? Perfect. University negates. The West has transformed the IMF from an economic institution into a political weapon designed to exploit developing nations. Barrow 03 confirms that nearly all developing countries have received help from the IMF. Problematically, the IMF forces countries to adjust their economies through neoliberal policies to cater towards the West. Thus, contention 1 is the planet of slums. Subpoint A is housing. Rickards 19 finds that 100% of IMF loans since the 1990s have forced governments to cut spending on pro-poor programs with the least politically influential interests, slashing spending into subsidies and housing. Mahmoud in 2010 explains that since the state can no longer provide housing supplies in the developing world rarely meet 20% of housing needs. Thus, Mahmoud concludes that IMF policies have been proven to be the inevitable recipe for the mass production of slums. Subpoint B is ravaging rural areas. Reinsberg in 2019 explains that the IMF imposed changes to food and agriculture sectors in 100 countries. For one, Chandra in 2010 finds that the IMF eliminated subsidies in Africa for food, pesticides, and fertilizers, and with higher costs, poor rural farmers are unable to compete and are forced to leave their farms. Moreover, Sonkin in 2020 reports that the IMF has played a pivotal role in enabling the financialization trend of rural economies through the financial sector deregulation, consolidating wealth among financial actors such as private equity funds who have little interest in feeding the world to seize public lands. Thus, Mariano in 2018 quantifies the IMF has enabled land grabs, pushing tens of millions of farmers off their land and have left 2 billion people malnourished and 124 million people in crisis-level hunger. The destruction of traditional rural economies accelerated the process of rural-urban migration to these countries. Thus, Prakash concludes that 50 million people leave rural areas every year to go to slums. Subpoint C is the shadow economy. Lang in 2010 finds that pension cuts and freezes are frequently included in IMF programs, along with minimum wage reductions. Without adequate salaries, urban citizens are pushed into the informal or shadow economy, characterized by below substance wages and slums. Kestos in 2020 quantifies that an increase in IMF participation by 1 standard deviation results in an increase in the shadow economy by 2.6%. Mahmoud thus concludes that liberalization has created a dumping ground for mega slums by accelerating job inequality, and informal sectors and informal workers now comprise over the half of the workforce in Latin America, with 70% over in sub-Saharan Africa as well. For these 3 reasons, Davis 06 writes that when the IMF restructured the economies of the third world in the 1980s, slums became an undeniable future for millions of poor rural migrants and their traditional urban citizens. Wallone in 2016 quantifies that 1 in 6 human beings on the planet today will live in slums, which is projected to rise in 1 in 4 or 2 billion people by 2030. Problematically, Marx in 2013 explains that slums result in coordination problems that hinder investment in unsanitary living conditions that affect human capital, creating a poverty trap for its residents, creating 2.6 times higher under 5 mortality rates than non-slum areas. Moreover, Johnson in 2017 explains that because of non-existent sanitation, dirty water, and close proximity to animals, scientists fear that the next pandemic will start from slums, which Samuel in 2019 quantifies will kill 80 million people and can reverse all the economic gains made in the last 2 decades. Contention 2 is austerity. The IMF has doubled down during COVID, as Oxfam writes that 80% of loans push for austerity measures that result in deep cuts to public health care. Oxfam furthers that countries are encouraged to freeze or cut public sector wages and jobs, meaning lower quality healthcare, fewer nurses and doctors. In fact, the WHO in 2020 quantifies that by 2030, countries who are receiving IMF assistance will see a shortage of 695,000 doctors. Moreover, Ibram 04 writes that IMF reforms include liberalization of drug prices that deregulate the pharmaceutical industry by importing branded drugs at enormous cost that soon displace domestic production, pushing local pharmacies into bankruptcy and pricing out the poor. As a result, disease is running rampant, as Samba 04 concludes that in Africa, IMF structural adjustment programs led to the tripling of malaria deaths and resurgence of infectious diseases. Thus, Pete 09 quantifies that 5 million children around the world die every single year due to IMF programs. Thus, university negates. Thanks.
Can I see whatever link evidence says 100% of IMF loans force cutting pro-poor programs, and everything on the shadow economy?
Yeah,
For
you
sure.
got it.
I can get you
Just for reference, please, just for me as a judge, please don't go faster than that. It'd be hard for me to pick up, but that's the speed for me anyway.
Sounds good.
Was the affirmative constructive too fast?
It was a little too fast. Yeah. I mean, I caught most of it, but yeah, just,
Okay. Do you want us to send a doc?
I caught most of it. Yeah.
Okay.
You said you wanted the evidence that says they cut pro poor housing, right? That
I
was the one?
already have that, Marcus. I got it.
Oh, I just sent it. So if you just get all the evidence on.
No, he wanted 100%. I can get that.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just sent the 100%.
Okay.
And I will get you all the evidence on the shadow economy. Shadow economy. Let's see. Just sent all the evidence for the shadow economy as well.
I'm good for cross whenever.
Yeah, sure. You can do first question.
Okay. So your C1 is about spending on housing programs and subsidies, and your C2 partially has to do with spending on like agricultural subsidies and things like that. So
No, our C2 is different from agricultural subsidies. It's just about freezing wages and pension cuts, and moreover, liberalizing the drug industry.
okay, so freezing wages and pension cuts, and then your entire like austerity contention is also about lower spending. So
Well, the
it sounds
freezing
like,
wages and pension cuts are specific to doctors. The other one's about agriculture.
yeah, but pensions from the government and spending cuts on government spending in healthcare, right?
Yeah, sure.
So it sounds like pretty much every link you read has to do with government spending in one way or another. So if we win that government spending goes up, do we control the link into every argument? Which don't we control the link to? I guess would be my question.
Sure. So we say that, I mean, any conditions the IMF imposes is an argument that you have to respond to. So I'm not sure what you're trying to get at.
But all of your arguments rely on the same analysis that government spending goes down. Obviously, you have evidence for that. So if we prove your evidence is wrong,
It's not government spending goes down, but rather they just cut wages and things like
government
that.
spending on wages, government spending on pensions, government spending on housing.
Sure. But I'm saying that any argument the IMF does is conditionality on that government. But I'm going to take a question.
Yeah, you can take a question.
So on your first warrant about credit and on your second contention about relief, what's the difference between the two warrants? Isn't it just the IMF increases credibility, so it increases aid?
No. Well, yeah, but they're different kinds of credibility. The C1, the first kind of credibility is the idea that countries are willing to tie their hands, so they're not going to do like bad macroeconomic policies that could worsen their debt situation. And the second warrant on aid is that countries are committed to improving their economies, so people know that they won't.
Wait. Isn't tying their hands and making sure they're not going to commit bad economic policy the same thing as they're going to whatever you just said on your second warrant?
I suppose. So in that case, you can consider it as both arguments having two links rather than each one having one. Can I have a question?
Yeah. Wait, it's not two links. It's just the same thing, right?
Well, it's not, right? There are two different kinds of showing that you're willing to keep your economy safe. One is that you're willing to listen to policy, and the other is that you're not going to pass policy. Or one is that you're just trying to improve your economy, and the other is that you're willing to listen to advice. Okay, so can I have a question?
Okay, yeah, sure.
Why do countries go to the IMF in the majority?
There's several different reasons. I don't know.
Okay, give me one of them.
Probably during crisis, probably do you want economic help or probably economic assistance for a particular industry?
In an economic crisis, particularly a debt crisis, what happens to tax revenue and government budgets?
Are you just going to say, oh, austerity causes government revenue to go down, or like recessions cause government revenue to go down? Well,
yeah, pretty obviously.
I'd say
one of your.
The problem is that we'd argue that austerity is a long-term consequence, whereas recessions
of 5-year loans.
No, they're not 5-year loans. In fact, historically, our evidence indicates that there's new waves of austerity that are coming that we can read in rebuttal as well, that can be expected to impact 5.8 billion people over the course of 12 to 13 years. So IMF austerity is not a short-term thing. And even if it is, countries continue to go back to the IMF to seek out loans. But
that would probably indicate that the IMF was positive if they're going back.
Okay, I'm going to call Roy and we'll take a couple seconds. That was 33 seconds. Order is just on their overview and then straight down the neg. Anybody not ready? Cool. On their overview, achieving interest through allocation of loans is significantly preferable to other methods the US has employed historically, like sanctions, coups, and interventions, all of which independently kill hundreds of thousands and probably cause a lot of the same stuff they're talking about. But as a top shelf response to their case, infrastructural development is catching up with initial surges in migration, as Riselma 12 of the UN finds that slum populations in Africa have decreased by 20% across most countries, and McVeigh 19 explains that 31 sub-Saharan countries have seen a doubling in the number of houses with sufficient living area, water, sanitation, and durability since 2000. This proves the biggest internal linkage to all three of their arguments is growth, which is increasing thanks to IMF loans rather than their individual conditionalities, i.e. if we win the uniqueness that the IMF increases growth, we turn their entire case. On their first link, 3 responses. First, the IMF doesn't impose conditions, they merely negotiate with countries, which is why Walter 08 empirically finds that in most cases, with or without the IMF, these same policies would have been passed as the countries intended to regardless. The only difference is the IMF provides policy expertise and wisdom to ensure these policies run smoothly, which is why Walter concludes that the IMF reduces the likelihood of economic crisis by 20%. Second, it's non-unique. Their evidence says they cut support to the least politically popular groups. This means the governments would have done it anyway. If we win any uniqueness on the IMF reversing these policies, the only risk of offense here flows AF. Then they concede in cross that countries turn to the IMF because they're experiencing debt or economic crisis, which massively crushes social spending, by far the biggest link into their arguments. They themselves say that austerity worsens crises, so the austerity born of economic crisis snowballs, subsuming their long-term analysis, which is why Yassin 04 finds a 1% increase in debt servicing decreases social spending by 4% because they have less money, which means we control an internal link into every argument they read, which is orders of magnitude larger than their decrease. On their second link, a few responses. First, you turn it, multi-billion-dollar multinationals can easily pay corrupt officials in almost any developing country or to deregulate or cut agricultural subsidies, triggering their link. If anything, you turn it, as Messick 20 indicates, that the IMF is increasingly making fighting corruption a condition to receive loans, reducing corruption in dozens of countries, protecting social spending, and saving millions. But then it's non-unique. PNAS 20 indicates that smallholder farms are trapped in vicious cycles of low yields and insufficient profits, meaning multinationals can always buy them out regardless. Third, you turn it. UN08 explains that in the coming decades of agricultural production, in the coming decades, agricultural production in Africa will fall by 90% because of climate change, non-uniquing their links. If anything, this is a turn, as Plant 20 explains, that thanks to global economic understanding and influence, the IMF is the only agency situated to fight climate change and has already formed a plan to reduce emissions by 20% through carbon taxes and other policies. On the third link, first, you turn it. ILO 20 finds that after 2001's Asia financial crisis, the IMF reformed its conditions to emphasize bottom-up growth. As a result, IMF programs since have on-net cut income inequality by 1.35 points on the Gini scale. Second, the internal link is identical to their C2. They're all about spending cuts. Third, the shadow sector is expanding regardless thanks to the advent of the internet economy, the dark web, cryptocurrencies, and more. Also, economic crises destroy formal jobs and increase poverty, forcing people into the shadow economy. It's definitely reverse causal. On austerity, turn it. The IMF has no reason to cut healthcare. Indeed, their own Oxfam database finds that most loans increase healthcare spending because the world wishes to avoid pandemics, which is why Rice 11 finds IMF programs empirically increase social spending on education and healthcare, increasing children's school enrollment by 7 percentage points, which increases incomes massively through better economic opportunity. Second, because the IMF wants to avoid conflicts which jeopardize its initiatives, it uses loan conditions to reduce military spending. As Gowan 07 writes, IMF-supported programs account for an 11% decrease in military spending. Indeed, Nelson 11 confirms this and finds that money is often shifted to social spending, increasing growth by 9%, turning their link, which also independently reduces the likelihood of conflict by avoiding arms races. Thus, we negate, or affirm, sorry.
Can I get one piece of evidence? Can I
Yep.
see the Selma evidence and like the infrastructure's catching up? Just any evidence you read there.
Absolutely. Riselma and McVeigh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep, I have both of those. Let me send them. Okay, there they are. Oh, for some reason the citation for McVeigh got cut, but it does have the link. I can resend the citation if you want.
All good.
Okay.
I'll let you know when I get it.
disregard the Borofsky evidence. I think that just got added for no reason.
Okay, I just got it. So I will go into a call for, and I'll let you know when we start running prep. Starting.
Can I get the, I think it's like Wyman 08 evidence on the first link about housing? Maybe I didn't catch the tag. I think it starts with a W and it was
What is
written
it?
to.
Oh, Yasin.
It's
Yasin.
in-
Oh, yes, Sen, sorry.
About debt spending.
It was the first response. It was written in 2000. No, not Yasin. That was the third response. It was,
Okay, I got you. I understand what you
Oh,
mean.
the Walter evidence.
yeah,
Yep.
it was a W.
I'll send it, Dilla.
And we've used 40 seconds so far.
It's sent.
All right, I'll let you know when you get it, and then we'll resume prep once I get it back into a call. I haven't gotten it yet, but I'll keep waiting. Just got it. I'll go into a call with Marcus. I'll let you know when we start prep. Starting. That was another 40 seconds used, so 1 minute 20 used, minute 40 remaining.
Okay, it's gonna start by frontlining, weighing their case. Okay, so if everybody's ready, then let's begin. Their first response essentially says the US government would have done other things to intervene. This doesn't make a lot of sense. We would just say that they're using structural reforms to get access to the economy of these countries. They're not going to randomly intervene in them. Moreover, we would say the sustainable path was a lot better prior to the IMF, because Pineo in 2014 writes that prior to the IMF, a lot of countries were following a gradual liberalization rate and growth was around 5% in Latin American countries. However, post IMF involvement, it is one of the lowest in the world because they've got crushed by domestic industries. Their next two responses essentially say that slums are decreasing. First of all, they've conceded the Wallonen evidence at the bottom of our impact section that says slums are going to rise to 2 billion people, and our evidence is post-dating by 4 years, meaning that the infrastructure is not catching up. Then, on there, we're going to go for our argument about housing. Their first response essentially says the IMF reduces the chance of a crisis. That's just a cross application of all of their arguments. They're just going to win defense on that. Second, their last two responses essentially say that they're going to cut spending no matter what. First of all, we would say that our argument is a prerequisite to all economic crises, because they've conceded the Lee evidence that the creation of slums in the 80s has led to an inevitable stunting of growth by over 2 decades. Meaning our argument is that every single country that's been monitored by the IMF is in a permanent recession, meaning all of their arguments are just triggered over and over again in the long run. Their last response is a crop application of solving for debt crises. I'll respond to that on their case. So first of all, our case is going to outweigh their arguments in the long term because of long-term underdevelopment, which creates future crises in the long run, meaning you're just pushing more and more loans on the IMF. Second is on magnitude and scope, because we're putting 2 billion people into slums. At best, you don't even, like, all of their arguments are very, very small. For example, 500 billion or 500 million out of a COVID crisis. then on their argument about China, we're just going to outweigh this here again, because if we win the IMF is bad, the EACG in 2020 finds the majority of IMF countries are starting to turn towards China and away from the IMF, and eventually the IMF will collapse. What this means is that there's not going to be any scrutiny or any competition, meaning that China is going to be allowed to run rampant, increasing corruption and all of the impacts they're talking about. So if we win our link, we are going to win a lot better of a link into their arguments on China. Go to their arguments. So as an overarching response, a lot of their impacts are talking about debt defaults. There's two reasons why debt defaults don't matter. First of all, Yadi in 2011 writes that the investors always want to access assets in this countries. So even if they default, growth is positive after a quarter after the default, meaning that there's going to be increased investment. But in second, Yadi also finds that investors just push off the loans to pay back in a future rate because they don't want the country to default. On their first argument about credit, first of all, they have no idea how much credit increases. Second, they also turn themselves on this argument because when they read the Goen evidence on our austerity argument, he finds that civil conflict increases by 20% because you put austerity on ethnic minorities, which we would say would crush. We would say this crushes credit ratings because no investor wants to invest in a country with a civil war. On their second argument about SDRs, first of all, they're not used. The EA in 2020 finds the 1 billion of the 183 billion used in 2008, only 1 billion was used because of the archaic system the IMF uses, and you can only trade with the IMF. Second, you have no idea when they're going to come. It's been an entire year of COVID, and you still haven't seen SDRs. On their second argument about debt, their first arguments, you increase investment because it's a signal. You can turn this because Gavani in 2018 finds is the investment is just from US multinational companies that just come in and build costly infrastructure projects and just leads to more cycles of debt, and these countries can't pay it off. On their second argument about the HIPC, it takes too long because Neiman in 2016 finds to get an HIPC, you have to wait around 4 years of austerity. Problematically, he finds the majority of countries break the conditionality, and as a result, in the 80s debt crisis, debt rose by 16% under the IMF, which directly turns their first impact about debt defaults on their argument about China, because they read that during the 80s crisis, millions of people fell into poverty. But on their last impact about China and hegemony, VOA in 2020 finds that China is just exporting digital surveillance across the BRI and the status quo, meaning the IMF isn't working.
Okay, I need a few pieces of evidence.
Yeah, sure.
I see the investment from U.S. companies leads to cycles of debt.
Yeah.
Can I see the only 1 billion was used on SDRs?
Mm-hmm.
Can I see growth is positive 1 quarter after?
You got it.
And then just that the HIPC caused the debt crisis of the 80s.
You mind putting those in the
Yeah,
chat?
Yeah, can you just type them in the chat?
Yeah, absolutely.
Beautiful.
That's fine, actually.
Yeah, let me get the debt.
Yeah, as soon as that's sent, I'm good for cross.
Let me get the liberalizing pre-IMF. And what was the last one? Oh
I think that was it.
That's it.
right?
No, I gotta get the investment leads to cycles of debt. Give me a second. Everything else should be sent though.
Okay, let me check right now.
And they all should be in decently separate emails where they make sense. So I think I put all the debt stuff together. So like the first two pieces of evidence are like the growth after 1 quarter nonsense, and then
Okay,
the HIPC debt increase in Africa.
perfect. All right, then I'm good for cross.
Wait 1 second. Let me mute myself.
You can take the first question, Marcus, if you're ready.
Yeah, for sure. So let's talk about China.
Let's.
So actually, let's just talk about the impact section, the second impact section about hedge. So why does civil conflict increase in authoritarian states?
Because when there's a repressive government, that reduces the ability of people to interact and to change how policy works in manners that are non-violent. That said, there was no response in rebuttal, so I'm
Yeah, I was just asking for the warrant. It's okay.
Okay, so you say that slums will rise to 2 billion people and that this is a prerequisite to economic crises because slums stunted growth.
Yeah.
Is stunting growth the same thing as causing a massive recession?
Yeah, because you conceded the Lee evidence that says that slums, because of rapid spreads of the disease, are going to set back economic development by 2 years, or I mean 2 decades. Sorry, a lot bigger than 2 years. So yes, so our analysis is going to be sure the IMF, like a lot of these countries were in crises during the 80s, and the IMF inserted themselves, but their policy advice failed, and as a result, they've been stunted for decades now, and they're basically in a permanent recession. So all of your turns aren't going to be very useful because we're going to say the reason why the IMF inserts themselves to like save growth in the first place in the long run was because of bad policy failures in the creation of slums.
Sure, but I don't think that's what your cards are saying, right? Your cards are saying that for the people in these slums, there's stunted economic growth, right? There's rampant disease. It's hard to find a job. There's very little economic mobility within slums, but your card cannot possibly be saying that every country in Africa and Latin America and Asia that has received money from the IMF is in a recession, because that is factually incorrect.
Well, like sure, there's times of growth, but we would say the growth
No,
was
almost
yeah,
all
yeah,
of
wait,
them
wait,
are
yeah,
growth.
no. To be clear. So one, our argument's going to be from the Pineo evidence that growth would be higher absent IMF intervention because of gradual liberalization. Two, we'd say sure there are some periods of growth, but over time as slums start to build up even more and more and disease starts to spread, those benefits are all offset and they're going to be rapidly set back by 2 decades, which is all conceded out of rebuttal.
I don't think that's conceded. Okay, you can take a question.
I mean, you did not answer the Lee evidence. Okay, so let's talk about SDRs. So
Yeah.
when are SDRs going to be released? Because they haven't been for like a year and a half now, right?
I don't work for the IMF. I think sometime in the summer is what they've said.
Okay, so like, all right, sure, sounds good.
Which we say still matters because as of now, most of the global south just hasn't had access to vaccines. And when they're projected to have access to massive imports of vaccines is the summer. So that's when they really need
Wait,
the
but
emergency
aren't vaccines supposed to be free for the developing world? Like, isn't that the plan to like massively produce?
I
vaccines?
think that is what some more opportunistic politicians have said, but we still think that giving them liquidity to spend on like vaccine administration campaigns is a good idea.
Okay.
Okay, we've used 33
Prep,
seconds. I'll call
before-
Roy and we'll take some more.
Before we take prep, which card says that the HIPC caused the 80s debt crisis?
Here, let me pull it up. It's the Neiman. I think it's titled Neiman. It doesn't say HIPC, but it says IMF involvement led to debt increasing by 16%. Yeah, or Neiman, Naiman.
Okay. Thank you.
Let us know when you start prep.
Yeah, I'll call you.
That was 103 used, so that's 136 total.
All right. Is everyone ready? For clarity, structure of this speech is down their case, extending defense and turns, then to our case. All right. Starting on the Walter turn, which is the first response on their first contention. He says Walter is a cross application. It's not. The evidence specifically indicates that the IMF does not impose conditions. They negotiate them, and that in every circumstance, countries are already going to pass the same policies that the IMF proposed. The IMF just helps them implement them better, which is why the chance of crisis goes down 20%. What does this mean? It means every argument they go for is non-unique and turned because those same policies were being passed by these countries with or without the IMF. The IMF just did them better, which is why the chance of crisis went down 20%. They're not winning a single argument in today's round, and we're linking into crises all over the world. With that said, we'll win the rest of the flow as well. The next turn to extend is the Messick evidence, which says, as a result of the IMF, countries must reduce their corruption in order to get the loans in the first place, which is why countries are now decreasing corruption substantially. They've conceded the analysis that corrupt officials siphon money away from public programs, which controls the link into every argument they go for. They siphon money from housing vouchers. They siphon money from public wages, increasing poverty, increasing slums, which means that the biggest internal link into the argument they say is most important is corruption. It is dropped. Also independently kills millions of people by cutting healthcare spending and hurts democracy in these countries. The next turn to extend is the climate change turn, which is also 100% conceded. Plant indicates that the IMF is the only country that has the economic evidence on enough countries to know how to solve emissions in those countries, and that their current plan will reduce emissions 80% through conditional lending and better practices, which is they've conceded links into 90% reduction in food over the next few decades, killing not just their 2 billion, but everyone, leading to starvation, which means food prices go up so people can't afford housing in the first place, and leading to less land because of rising tides that forces people into slums. We control 8 billion people, their 2 billion were longer term and have two prereqs in their arguments. It's over. Even then, they're not winning this argument. On their argument about slums, they say that the reason for everything is slums. They've missed that the reason for slums is the debt crisis that led countries to the IMF in the first place. The Yassin evidence goes drop that debt reduces social spending. Their own evidence says the first thing on the chopping block is housing vouchers. They've conceded that the only reason you turn to the IMF is because you're in a debt crisis. So long before they came to the IMF, they were cutting slums already. The only difference is that the IMF A helps them manage it better per the Walter turn, and B reduces their debt, which controls the biggest internal link to slums, which is why slums are decreasing now. Even then, our health spending turns also solve every argument they go for. They've conceded that the IMF cuts inefficiencies and bureaucracy to increase health spending and increase education, giving people social mobility to pull themselves out of slums and reducing the spread of disease in those slums, which is why we haven't seen a single pandemic and millions of lives are saved every single year. On their liberalization turn, one, it's a policy, so Walter non-uniques it, and two, their evidence doesn't indicate that they weren't. Their evidence doesn't indicate that they were liberalizing. It says they weren't liberalizing pre-IMF, and those periods of ISA are only beneficial for so long. Our evidence indicates that globalization caused by the IMF has lifted 3 billion people out of poverty, and through trade interdependence has massively reduced the likelihood of conflict, controlling the link and everything else. On our case, none of their turns matter because they've conceded the Walter evidence, but even on the HIPC, their evidence misses the point. It's from 1999. The HIPC was enacted in 98. Our evidence from 15 years later says HIPC massively reduced debt, solving their other turns, and linking into my arguments on their case that debt is the internal link to all their social spending cuts. It's a really clear AF ballot.
Okay, I cut out on your responses to liberalization at the top. What were they?
ISI is only beneficial for so long because sectors can only develop in that state for so long, and the liberalization you say the IMF caused has lifted 3 billion people out of poverty and reduced the chance of conflict by increasing trade interdependence and lowering the cost of goods.
Okay, great. So I believe Marcus and I have 1:40 of prep.
Oh, and also Walter applies was the last thing I said.
Yeah, sure. Okay. And the Walter evidence was that they would do it without it, right? And the IMF is crisis. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I will call Marcus and then I will let you know when we start running prep. Starting now.
I believe that's your prep.
Yeah, that's our prep. The order is going to be the neck. And it'll probably be addressing the weighing that Marcus read in rebuttal first. Is anyone not ready? Perfect. The IMF is no longer an economic institution for development, but rather a political weapon designed to exploit developing countries. They have conceded Marcus's weighing that he reads in second rebuttal, that because all these countries perceive that the IMF policies are bad, they are shifting going towards China. And as a result, no country is going to be involved with the IMF in the near future, but rather with China. There are a couple implications to this weighing mechanism to all of their offense on our case. First, on the climate argument, if these countries are going to China, they're no longer going to implement IMF economic climate change policies, which means that their arguments do not happen in any sort of world. But second, it also turns all of the link turns all of the debt arguments, because like they say themselves, because Chinese investments is often so opaque and not clear in the first place, and often leads to so many asset seizures, it's far worse than any sort of IMF loan, which link turns every single argument that they go for themselves. It is game over for them. But let's deal with debt spending in the first place. They argue that debt decreases social spending, and it's linked into all of our arguments, but coincidentally, they've conceded all the yada evidence on their case that says that debt crises do not matter for two reasons. A, the first reason is that investors always want to prioritize the assets that country has, and moreover, continue to invest 1 quarter after that debt crisis happens, meaning that social spending does not go down. But second, they often just push off the date at which the debt is due, which means debt crises do not control the link into social spending. Okay, let's deal with our arguments. Our argument is that since the 1990s, 100% of IMF loans have forced cuts in social spending into housing interests. This is really problematic because now states cannot afford to fund any sort of housing mechanism, which is why only 20% of countries are able to fund housing. The only response that we get is that this would have happened in either world. A, this does not happen in either world. Our evidence concludes that countries would have done gradual liberalization over the course of time. They say that sectors wouldn't have been developed. The problem is they concede the Latin American empiric that historically these sectors were developed because Latin America was achieving 5.5% GDP above the national average. Well, as soon as they signed onto an IMF loan, their GDP dropped by 20%. Then they say also, like, even if they say that it's worse, they would negotiate it insofar as they're all going towards China. That doesn't matter because those loans are corrupt in the first place. That response also applies to their argument about corruption because there's no warrant as to why corruption even exists in the first place. They don't read a warrant as to why IMF decreases corruption. But second, and more importantly, corruption would probably get a lot worse in a world with the IMF insofar as these countries are not with China. Insofar as these countries are going to China, they have a lot more opaque deals and a lot more asset seizures. It's a lot worse in their world, which is what they have conceded themselves. Then on all this emission stuff, moreover, none of this implications were extended in rebuttal, no weighing mechanisms on it, no impact defense on it, or no impact extensions on it. None of that was in rebuttal. You should be very uncomfortable voting on it in the first place. And yet again, they also consider the long-term weighing analysis that we do, that the only reason as to why these countries keep going back to the IMF is because the IMF themselves has underdeveloped nations. And the best way to stop the IMF from doing that is to vote for the negative and develop those domestic industries, which is preventing 2 billion people from going into slums. That is the biggest impact in the round, and that's the only impact in the round. Please vote nay.
Okay.
All good for Graham.
Yeah, of course.
Can I have the first question?
Yeah.
Why is China having opaque loans a reason the IMF is bad?
What? No, our analysis. No. To be clear, our analysis, which was conceded problematically for you, is that if we win our link that the IMF slightly, like even a marginal win on our link that the IMF is bad, it pushes countries to China loans, and the ECAG evidence says that inevitably China will have most of the lending money, which means there's going to be less competition with the IMF, which increases opaqueness, which means you're probably not going to have green infrastructure investment.
So wait, Marcus. So
because that's not a-
competition with the IMF is good.
Yeah,
So you're saying that the IMF is bad, but when the IMF goes away, the world
China will be bad because the IMF won't be there. That's our argument. Right now, the IMF is supposed to improve practices so that it doesn't get replaced by China.
Yeah, but our analysis is that the IMF is failing now. They're just going to switch away from the IMF, and it gets significantly worse.
If
But
you
that's
win
not a
this
reason
trade-off-
why the IMF, at best, that's a non-unique on like everything in the round. And at worst, that's still a reason why the IMF is good, because the existence of
No,
the IMF.
no, I don't think
is
so.
competition
I
with
think
China.
at worst, it's a non-unique. At best, it link turns everything because we're saying the IMF is inherently bad, and then it has led to worse outcomes of countries turning to China.
Yes, but
Without the IMF, countries would have turned to
final-
China.
No,
Eli,
the
without the
analysis that
IMF, countries would have turned to China because it's the only source
no,
of.
they're turning.
Wait,
to
that's not
now.
true. They would like there no evidence is read on that. We could say
You
they would
say that
turn to the
absent the IMF, everyone turns to China.
Wait, that's not true.
Wait,
No,
Marcus.
no. Our analysis is nobody has to rely on any kind of loans. And for example, they would just have gradual liberalization. However, their economies have been new. They're in perpetual cycles of recessions and underdevelopment, meaning they're forced to receive loans. They need loans. Now they're just turning to China.
Okay. So your argument is that absent the IMF, rapid liberalization wouldn't have happened. So no one would have gone to the IMF. But they went to the IMF for liberalization to occur. This makes no sense.
Wait, no. Our argument is that the IMF inserted themselves into a lot of these countries. It wasn't by choice, but it was by force.
But we spent a lot of time on this.
Okay, you can take a question.
Yeah, sure. So when is the IMF going to reduce emissions by 80%?
It's already happening. That's the conceded implication and evidence.
I'm pretty sure the evidence says it's a proposal, but I don't know. You can have a question. Probably doesn't matter.
I mean, there are two pieces of evidence, and more importantly, right, this is significantly more conceded than the like China weighing thing.
Well, I mean, I think both are conceded. You didn't respond to it.
Okay,
We didn't
so-
respond to that.
The China weighing is just our argument. Like in rebuttal, you said word for word, and the IMF will eventually collapse, which means there's no scrutiny or competition for China. So
No,
the IMF.
That's not a reason. The IMF
No, your argument is that IMF is good because you increase competition. Our argument is the IMF is bad and it is pushing countries more towards China.
That is all conceded.
Because they don't want to turn to the IMF, which establishes the binary that is our argument. If countries don't like the IMF, they go to China. So if there is no IMF, they go to China. Which
Our
means
argument is
IMF itself
because they're
is
going
causing
to
countries to
how
go
can
down.
the IMF push countries to China if it's not because countries don't want to turn to the IMF, which is our argument?
That's cross. Okay, we have 125 left. I'll call Roy and we'll take it.
How much prep do you have?
So 15 seconds left. So we're at 111. We had 127. Okay.
Okay. The order is going to be this China stuff. Then the Walter debate. I'll just signpost. It's going to start on China. That's sorry. I can't give a better roadmap than that. Anybody not ready? Okay. They go for a Hail Mary with this China argument, but it makes no sense. The fact that China is harmful is not a reason to vote neg. They're not analyzing the counterfactual. Absent the IMF, countries would have had to go to China regardless, but there would have been less competition at the outset with China, so China's practices would have been more opaque and worse for a longer period of time, and there would have been no competition at the outset, which means that China never would have had an incentive to change in the first place. That's our Gerstel evidence indicating that without the IMF, China would be the one and only source of liquidity and would be far more opaque. This means we link turn everything they read in the round with nothing constraining them. China would seize assets and use hidden debt to crush economies, forcing rapid liberalization so their massive export market could profit, etc. Every argument they go for would have occurred far worse in a world without the IMF. At this point, you know you're affirming, but even then, this is weighing off their liberalization argument, which they definitely aren't winning. They've conceded the Walter evidence in every speech that the IMF doesn't impose conditions. They merely provide advice on policies countries were already planning to adopt. Call for it, it's dropped. In an empirical analysis of conditionalities, Walter finds that the policies would have been exactly the same, just in the world without the IMF, where there's no feedback from the IMF and no wisdom from the IMF helping countries pass the policies. And the feedback and the help from the IMF is more expert than what these countries were going to do clandestinely, which is why the chance of economic crisis fell 20% after the IMF intervened. Another place you can affirm pretty comfortably. Even then, the only response to our climate change argument is this nonsense China weighing. You have absolutely no idea when this is going to occur. The IMF is only expanding in terms of loans and capital right now, so it's obviously decades away. They have conceded that climate change kills nearly 8 billion people because it wipes out the capacity for people to produce food, crushing incomes through food scarcity and resource loss, leading to slums. They've also conceded that the IMF is using conditionality to reduce emissions in the future by 80%, which is the biggest impact in the round, again, because it links to extinction, and it's also conceded so it has 100% probability and 100% strength of link. Liberalization is orders of magnitude smaller than climate change, and so is slums. It is a really, really clean AF ballot. We're link turning everything they go for, and we have pretty awesome offense ourselves.
Okay, it's probably going to follow the same order as Eli, except extending our case in there as well. Okay. So if everybody's ready, then let's begin. So on this really confusing weighing debate, our argument is that the IMF is so bad that it's also pushing countries away towards China, and the ECAG finds that this will inevitably collapse the IMF, which means that China is allowed to run rampant without any competition or scrutiny, increasing opaqueness and avoiding things such as environmental loans. They just say, well, they would have just inevitably gone to China. No, the Pineo evidence answers this, that prior to IMF involvement, countries were on a scale of gradual liberalization. However, the IMF forced their stance away from gradual liberalization to a full set neo-colonial, full set of reducing tariffs, which decreased growth by 20%. This is conceded, and we tell you that because of this, they are outcompeted. What this means is that absent IMF involvement, no country should be turning towards China, and they'd have a lot higher growth. This answers their Walter turn about increasing or decreasing the chance of crises by 20%, because we'd say in the long run, they're not going to face as many crises because they're a lot more stable. They just say, well, this Walter evidence says they would have done it already. No, our Huffington Post evidence is very good, finding that they weren't planning to do gradual liberalization, or they weren't planning to rapidly liberalize, but take their time. But the IMF rapidly forced them to do so, destroying their economy and any chance of economic growth. Okay, so what is our argument? Our argument is that 100% of IMF loans since the 90s forced cuts in spending with least political interest, slashing poor services, and because the state can't provide supplies, the developing world will have less than 20% of their needs, pushing people into slums, which will impact 2 billion people by 2030, spreading rapid disease and pushing millions of people into poverty. They just say their turn outweighs on climate change. So first of all, if we win our China Lincoln, then you're not getting access to climate change. Two, they say you reduce emissions in the future by 80%. You have no idea what the future is. We'd say you prefer us on time frame because you know the IMF has caused people to go in slums by 2030, which is a lot bigger of an impact and a lot more tangible because you have no idea when the IMF is actually going to do this environmental nonsense.
Good round. Thank you so much for judging.
Thank you all so much for judging.
Hey, I'd love to see the Walter evidence. I'm going to drop my email here.
Absolutely. Would anyone else like Walter? Or I guess it's in the chain for everyone.
I'm not in the chain.
Yeah, I'll send it.
Yeah, make sure Walter is in the chain.
Yep, it's 2 cards. It's an email from me, 1251.
Yeah. And also the is it Panetti?
Pineo. Yeah, I can send.
Pineo.
I'll send all the stuff we read on that.
Just make the highlights concise, Mark.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, all the Pineo stuff sent.
Our evidence is sent to you as well, Mr. Odenkirk.
Okay, my decision is in.
The decision is ready if everyone's good. Okay, so congrats to both teams for making it to quarterfinals of the TOC. You all did really well, and it was a 2-1 for the con. Does whoever voted pro want to go first?
Yep, I'll start. Where's my notes here? Sorry, just a second here. Okay. Oh, return home. What's my ballot? Sorry, trying to find where I wrote all my notes. Okay, all right. So, yeah, this is kind of a weird round. I think so. First of all, the China argument doesn't make sense for a reason for me to vote con. The pro evidence says, and it's pretty clearly extended, that without the IMF, that they must go to China. The con argument is the IMF is so bad that the countries are moving to China. I mean, it seems to me then we want at least IMF to stay there on the process that some have an off chance of choosing IMF rather than China. So I'm not sure why that's necessarily a con evidence. The Walter evidence is extended as non-uniquing a lot of the stuff, the whole debate. I don't think that Walter evidence says that policies would have been the same, but I also don't think that the con ever challenges that interpretation of the Walter evidence. And so I have to give the con that interpretation. It clearly says that it decreases crises, and the con is, or the pro is making the argument that these things would have happened anyway through a variety of warrants, and that's not really challenged very much. Here are the things that are extended, which I think are weird. So the climate impacts are pretty new in the pro summary, right? I think. What's weird about this is that the final focus of the con doesn't make that argument, right? They go to the link arguments and challenge whether or not the climate argument is true. I think had the final focus person from the con said, look, my summary speaker said they're new, right? The pro final focus never indicates that they're not new or not kind of extrapolated. I think this is an incidence of where those arguments in the con that their impacts are new aren't made. And so the pro final focus is going to extend those impacts. And I need that extended. So I need that consistency between the summary of the con and the con final focus. It's not there. So to me, those impacts are in the round because that's not an argument in the con final focus. At that point, even if I grant the decrease 20% to the con, I'm not sure how it outweighs the climate impacts that they're extending and not being challenged in the final focus. So I ended up voting on the climate turn.
I can go first, Odenkirk.
I'd love to go, but I just don't. The YouTube recording, they're still recording on YouTube. I don't want to.